So this evening, we're going to look at mitzvah number 4, which is the mitzvah of Jewish time. And it's in the Parsha of Bo. Right, this week we read Shmos, next week we read Va'era. And as the top line says, there are no mitzvos there. And in the Parsha of Bo, we began to encounter mitzvos. Remember, the Jewish people are in Egypt. They're starting to learn about the Exodus. They're starting to learn about Pesach and the Pesach offering. So there are mitzvos. But the first mitzvah is the mitzvah of Jewish time. There are actually 20 commandments in Parsha of Bo, 9 positive, 11 negative. And this is the mitzvah of establishing the months. It's called Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctifying the new month. And before we just jump in, just the commandment is, as it says, is to sanctify the months and intercalate la'aber shanim, kadesh chadashim la'aber shanim. Kiddush, we think of Kiddush, right? Fill us with the rosé. Usually think of Kiddush over wine, but the goal is to sanctify. And we can sanctify without objects, with words, and we can also sanctify without actions. We can sanctify with celebrations. And here we have a commandment to sanctify the months. Intercalate is a very fancy word, and it means to create leap years, which is very timely for this year. On the Jewish calendar, it is a leap year, which means that our Jewish year will have an extra month, an extra Adar, right? Everyone complained, Rosh Hashanah is too early, Hanukkah is too early, Purim will be late, Pesach will be late, Rosh Hashanah will be late, making it a real truism when my father liked to say the holidays are either early or late. They're never on time. And so that's what we encounter because of the intercalation of the years. At the Beth Din, the religious court that is greatest in wisdom and ordained with authority in the land of Israel. And to set the dates of the year's festivals according to that sanctification, for it is stated, and I'm reading the Hebrew verse, second line, HaChodesh Hazel Lochem Rosh Chadashim. This month is the head of the months. This is the first months. In other words, when you see the renewal of the moon, you will establish for yourselves the beginning of the month, and thus do, even if you do not see it, once it is due to be seen according to the accepted reckoning. So there's an idea, there's a mitzvah for the religious courts to sanctify, to determine, to announce the months. And a couple of points, and if you have other themes that you see in this first paragraph, please share. But a few things that stand out to me. One, it's a religious court, doesn't just happen. Mention something about it being the greatest in wisdom and ordained with authority. Has to be the greatest in wisdom. So let's say you have some, mediocre judges. Are they allowed to do this? Land of Israel. What about outside of Israel? How does the Jewish calendar work outside of Israel? And after it says you have to see the month, you notice it says, even if you don't see it, once it's due to be seen, according to the accepted reckoning. So there does seem to be a standard timeline that that a new month has to happen. This precept also includes a religious obligation to intercalate the year by adding a lunar month when necessary. For the fundamental reason for the precept of sanctifying each month is that the Israelites might observe the holy days of the eternal Lord at their proper times. And the intercalation of the years for the same fundamental reason. Indeed, apart from this verse, there's evidence in other verses which points to this precept of intercalation. Thus, it's written, you shall keep the Passover at its season of spring. Right? In that we not only do we have a lunar calendar based on lunar months, but it's also solar seasons. You have to have Pesach in the spring. And so that is how this plays itself out. And this is the way it works. How does it happen? Bottom paragraph on the page in Hebrew or in English. What's the inyan ha-mitzvah? How does it operate? 2 reputable Israelites come before the Beth Din and testify before them that they saw the moon in its renewal. The judges set the beginning of the month according to their word by saying, the day is hallowed, mikudash. Right? It requires a kiddush. You have to actually say that this is the new month. The reason why this precept is only for the ordained rabbinic authorities to fulfill is that it's explicitly stated, this month shall be for you to sanctify, for those as great and as ordained, invested with authority as you. Who was the initial commandment given to? From God to Moses and Aaron. So from that verse that Moses and Aaron were given this commandment, people like Moses and Aaron have to ordain, have to calculate the new month. Right, there's also a midrash which says like this. So that speaks to all the community, meaning the greatest sages in Israel. Likewise, any great scholar and jury who was ordained in the land of Israel, or the way in which ordination is conferred is known, has the authority to fulfill the precept even outside the land of Israel. So it goes on to the fact it has to be a great rabbi in Israel or a great rabbi who studied in Israel. So let's just stop for a moment. What will happen if you don't have great rabbis in Israel? What happens if you don't have great rabbis outside of Israel who study in Israel? What happens to the Jewish calendar? Based on what we've seen so far, how will you have a Jewish calendar if you don't have this setup? You don't have the personnel required. Any thoughts? How do you have a calendar if you don't have the rabbis? How do you have a calendar if you don't have the people in Israel? So the word that we saw earlier, which is the chinuch quoting from the Talmud, is important because it's going to happen. The calendar happens no matter what, right? Even if you don't have the rabbis, once the month is due to start based on the accepted reckoning. So at some point, the calendar is not about the rabbis. It's not about the rabbis from or educated in Israel. At some point, it's going to be about, right? You can't stop time, right? Time stands still for no person. And therefore, you have no choice but for the months to continue. Now, you'll need certain rabbinic intervention to have the exact days of the calendar or to decide when the leap years are, but you can't stop the clock completely. So what do we do today, right? What happens today? That's what the chinuch has next. Second paragraph on the second page of the mitzvah, right? We have no properly ordained authorized sages. No, however, this is the tradition we have received. Rabbi Hillel Hanassi, the son of Rabbi Judah Hanassi, was the outstanding scholar of his generation. He was properly ordained in the land, and he was the sage who prepared for us the reckoning of the cycle of the intercalation. He sanctified the months and intercalated the years that were determined to come until Elijah would arrive to herald the advent of the Messiah, and on that we rely today. Some of you may have seen there's a book that all sitting on offices have. It's called the 150-Year Jewish Calendar. You may have seen it. And so usually it's really, worn book because it came out about 100 years ago. So there's only about 50 years left. Never fear. Doesn't matter how many are in the calendar. We know how it's going to work out. There is a Jewish calendar forever that's been put in place. And it's referencing the fact that the calendar that we had that was put in place by the great ordained sages of Israel. And the mechanism that was used is that this Rabbi Hillel knew the mathematics, knew the astronomical calculations of how long it takes for the moon to orbit the earth, and was familiar with being able to calculate how long it takes for the earth to orbit the sun, which is what you need to determine the seasons. And he gathered the rabbis and put in motion this formula, which takes us to this very day. If you're thinking they must be very good at math, you are correct. If you're thinking that it's some cutting edge astronomy, you are correct. It's not only Jewish astronomy. It wasn't just rabbinic minds at work here, but based on what scholars, scientists of the time knew. We're talking about 1700 years ago. It became, it was cutting edge. They had the mathematical formula, right? I'm teaching this on Zoom from where my son has taken some of his classes. I see an algebra book in front of me, right? There's mathematics that go into calculating how long it's going to be, how many days, how many hours, how many minutes, how many portions of a minute, right? Some of you may have heard in Shul a couple of weeks ago when we announced the new moon will appear. When will it appear? We announced what day of the week, what time, what hour of the day, how many minutes in the hour, how many portions of a minute. And that's what we have happening here, because the rule is, and Maimonides sets it out, and it's referenced a little bit further in here, that if you don't have the rabbis of Israel in Israel scheduling the Jewish calendar, there is no Jewish calendar. And therefore, that would be very difficult because we no longer have that rabbinic continuity. And historically speaking, this was taking place approximately the year 350. And the year 350 was a period of great instability in the land of Israel. For those of you familiar with the history of world at the time, Israel was controlled by the Roman Empire. And this is around the time that a Roman emperor named Constantine accepted Christianity as official religion of the Roman Empire. And this led to not only Roman control over Israel, but also it was also religious persecutions. As you know, some of you may have heard of the book or read the book Constantine's Sword. This is the beginning of the Roman Empire using religion as a way to counter Judaism. And they made it very hard for the rabbis to continue to assemble with a Sanhedrin, with a rabbinic court system. And so Hillel and his colleagues realized we have to do something now to put in place a calendar system. Otherwise, it will be lost based on the rules that we have. We're going to see a source a little bit later. You're familiar with the fact we have a Babylonian Talmud and we have a Jerusalem Talmud, Bavli and Yerushalmi. What's the difference? Well, the Babylonian Talmud was edited in Babylon and the Yerushalmi Talmud was edited in Israel. The Babylonian Talmud was edited about 150 years later than the Jerusalem Talmud. And the Jerusalem Talmud was finished, was edited around this time also, because it's post this period of in the timeline when this period of the timeline when there were no longer academies or court systems or great rabbinic authorities able to function creatively anymore. So the Talmud Yerushalmi is closed. The conversation shifts to Bavel, to the Babylonian academies. The calendar is now set to this very day. This question was posed: what are halakim? A halak is a portion of a minute, and this is how we calculated how long this cycle goes. There is. If we see just a little later on, when it starts talking about how this calculations would take place, right? If you look on the next page, on the third page of Sefer HaChinuch, it talks about we reckon the months and holy days according to the days of the lunar year, which is 354 days, 8 hours, and 876 parts, right? Apart 48 minutes and 40 seconds. It is less than the solar year by 10 days, 21 hours, 204 parts. You see, they're doing some calculations. The solar year is 365 days, and lunar year is 54 days, but the solar year is more than 365. It's 365 and a quarter in a few minutes. And the lunar also is longer than just the 29 days. And that's why Jewish months have either 29 or 30 days. Yes, Elliot. Just make sure to unmute before you ask your question.
I'm just amazed of every Shabbat we hear the time of 4:12, 4:14. San Francisco could be 4:18, whatever. Who makes those times today?
So a lot these days can be done. A lot can be done. Go to Chabad.org or your local synagogue website. You'll find the information. I think first it's important to point out that the calendar was put in place. When we're talking about how the calendar works, that was put in place based on this mathematical system, and the numbers work out. In fact, the numbers are very close to being 100% accurate, even some 700-800 years later. We're a couple of minutes off. We're not statistically complicated, because we could get into trouble then, right? Because and there were times, and maybe this will be a subsequent class on the subject, that there were times when there was a dispute in the Jewish community as to whether there should be a leap year or not, and you had different communities focused on different days. There was one year in particular, is known as the Great Calendar Controversy, took place around the year 900. These days the entire Jewish community is interconnected, technologically, so you have that capability. But a lot of this was determined astronomically. When you hear about candle lighting time, we know that Shabbos begins, and we'll move into this as well tonight, that the Shabbos begins at sunset. So therefore, you need to know what time sunset is, and sunset has been calculated astronomically, right? I always remember growing up that for every city, every locale, every longitude and latitude, the Naval Observatory is able to calculate when is sunset. So if sunset in a particular place is 4:30 on a Friday, then candle lighting is 4:12. And these days you can be so accurate that there can be a minute or so difference within different locales based on exactly how far east or exactly how far west or longitude and latitude calculation. So the difference between my house and your house, even if we're in the same general area, can still be a minute off or so. And so that's why usually, sometimes you'll have a city that has several congregations that will all have different candle lighting times being a minute or so off and the like. And so, all of this was very much the responsibility of the rabbis. If you just skip to the end of page 3, it says that this commandment is enforced at every place, at every time that we shall have ordained authorized sages under the conditions that we have written. Should someone transgress this precept and not carry it out, if he is a sage, he has disobeyed a positive precept, and his punishment is very great because he causes distortion in the observance of the holy days. But nowadays, that for our sins, we do not intercalate the years to ordained authorities. We rely for our reckoning on the calculation received in tradition from Rabbi Hillel, as we have stated. Sefer Achidah concludes that basically this is a mitzvah that can't be fulfilled, but it's still a mitzvah that all of us is responsible for. And it's the idea of sanctifying time. And this gets, I see Phyllis put in a question about, why 18 minutes before. There really is a concept of Jewish time. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that even though the commandments were given to us by God, who determines, what's kosher, what's not kosher, what's allowed, what's not allowed, time is something that we control. So for example, if we're going back to the example, 4:30, let's say sunset on Friday is 4:30. At 4:29 and 58 seconds, you can strike a match. At 4:30 and 2 seconds, it's a violation of Shabbat. There's a very fine, but according to whose watch? Is it your watch or my watch? I think about this, some people who you may be at the Daily Min, we have this like atomic clock, which determines when we start. But it seems that it slipped a little bit. Right now, it seems that it's like 30 seconds slow. Like everyone's Apple times it says 4:30, but it takes another 20 seconds for the clock to say 4:30. So which time is 4:30? And here we get to this idea that there's a certain human element of sanctifying time. Just for example, if you look on the source sheet, the second link in the chat, there's a Talmud in Masechet Beitza. Tractate Beitza was studied recently for Daf Yomi. That formulates it as follows: a Tana taught a Braita before Ravina with a slightly different reading. You conclude the blessing with "who sanctifies the Jewish people Shabbat in the seasons." That if you're at the end of the blessing on a holiday that's on Shabbat, you say Mikadesh Yisrael Shabbat v'hazmanim. Now that may sound strange to some of you because it is. We don't say it that way. We say, Ravina said, do we say that the Jewish people sanctify Shabbat? Isn't Shabbat already sanctified from the 6 days of creation? Every 7th day is automatically Shabbat without the need for any declaration on the part of the Jewish people. Rather say it as follows: who sanctify Shabbat, the Jewish people in the seasons. As the Jewish people sanctify the new moon in the festival days, and we follow this opinion. Right? We say Mikadesh HaShabbat v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. God sanctifies Shabbat. God sanctified Israel. Israel sanctifies time. We are given the awesome responsibility and opportunity to control time. We're the ones, we can't say when the sun is no longer shining that it's still daytime, but we're the ones who determine when the holidays are. We were given the responsibility for the calendar, the rabbis as our representatives, and now we have a Jewish calendar. We're the ones who determine the timing of the religious responsibilities and obligations. And so because of that, when it comes time to fulfilling these responsibilities, we want to be a little bit careful. If sunset is 4:30, I don't want to get caught into this problem. Am I a few seconds after or not? And so therefore, in order to protect the integrity of the sanctity of the new day, like Shabbat candle lighting, we decided to light Shabbos candles a certain amount of time before sunset. How much time is enough time? Well, technically a minute, but if you're not so sure, use your clock a minute slow, a minute fast, make it a couple of minutes. And the rabbis, what did they do when they didn't have watches and clocks? They based it upon how long it took to walk a certain distance. How long it would take them to get from point A to point B, that time span. And 18 minutes is the approximation of that distance time span that they used to walk. So we have 18 minutes. Some say it's 14 minutes, 18 minutes. 18 minutes became standard. Some places 20 minutes. Some places want to be even more careful. If you've ever been in Jerusalem, the siren goes off 45 minutes before sunset. But these are all additions that, since time is absolute, and we are not absolute individuals, we determine the calculation to give us some wiggle room. You don't want 18 minutes, you need more time. Okay, you can take more time, but just recognize that as you get closer and closer to 0 hour, you run the risk of being off, because we're irresponsible for managing time, but time is an absolute quantity and variable that's really much out of our control. So that is with regards to moving away from the calendar. We're getting here into the idea that it was an amazing opportunity and responsibility for calculating, when is the right time for the performance of holidays, but it also factors into the days. It all factors into daily ritual life. And here we come to something that people talk about: Jewish time, right? Jewish time means not on time, right? And they, so they talk about, like Hasidim, for example, are chronically late, or certain Middle Eastern Jewish communities are chronically late. I know from personal experience of a family of Syrian Jews that the wedding is called for 6 o'clock. So that's the invitation. 6 o'clock is the time when the invitation they sent to their Ashkenazi friends. And 4:30 is the time of the invitation they sent to their Syrian friends, because everything is always running late. So if you it starts at 4:30, the friends come a couple hours late, then they'll be on time. This is, first we can talk about, is this professional? Is this respectful? Right, being on time. Punctuality is a virtue, but it's the Jewish implementation of time which actually opens up these flexible time frames. So, for example, this is the perfect time of year, right? Last night was the longest night of the year, right? The winter, December 21st, first day of winter, is the longest night. Jewish hours are not always 60 minutes. Jewish hours are calculated by taking the amount of daylight and dividing that into 12 equal parts. So when there are 720 minutes of daylight, an hour is 60 minutes. But what happens when sunrise is, let's say, 7 o'clock and sunset is like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, right? That's 600. That's 600 minutes divided by 12. How long is an hour? 50 minutes. What happens when sunrise is 6:30 and sunset is 8:30? How long is an hour? 70 minutes. It gives new meaning to the term lunch hour, or I'll see you in an hour, or I'll see you in half an hour. So the idea of, since we've been given control of time, there will be applications, and we will be implementing different times and different time periods. And so that is, with regards to this idea of flexible Jewish time. They also tell the joke, right? This is the season where I commemorate my annual stand-up comedy routine on Christmas Eve, that they tell the joke that, in the Torah, the Jewish people got into a lot of trouble with the golden calf. Why did they build a golden calf? Because Moshe wasn't back. Moshe's not back. We don't know what to do. Moshe's late. We need a new leader. They worship a golden calf. And so ever since that mistake, which was because of their attention to punctuality and being exact in time, we've thrown away the watches, and Jews have never been on time again. That's the outgrowth of the sin of the golden calf. That since we were so careful about time, that completely led to a sin. So now we're completely off of time, and we don't even pay attention at the clocks. As my Chabad rabbi like to say in school when we would daven, there are no clocks in heaven. And so that is how Jewish time isn't really equivalent to the way we have our calculations of hours, and it sometimes has a certain amount of flexibility. In terms of the way this is determined in terms of Shabbos candlelighting time, is a question that came in on the chat. We just know the Torah says Vahi Erev, Vahi Voker. It talks about time periods, evening and then morning, and so therefore evening is when the day begins. Evening, what is the definition of evening? The Talmud talks: is it sunset? Is it nightfall? And this leads to all sorts of different ritual questions, right? You know that we start Shabbos at sunset, we end Shabbos at nightfall. We start Shabbos the earlier time it might start, and we end Shabbos as late as possible. We want to make sure that we don't break Shabbos in the beginning. We don't want to make sure that we end Shabbos too soon at the end. So we're kind of strict in the beginning and strict in the end. There are certain groups that don't follow that. They're strict on both ends. So, for example, certain groups of Hasidim, especially Hasidim from Hungary, they won't worry about starting Shabbos until an hour after sunset, because they're very strict about the day doesn't begin until nightfall and the latest form of nightfall. So their Friday nights will start very late and their Saturday nights will be very late. Again, that's another concept of Jewish time, is that so many of the things that are timely, we know the days, but the times have different variations of how to interpret the right time for something. So that also leads to the idea of time slipping. The idea of time not being simply chronological, but being something that is sacred and sanctifiable, it can be learned with a couple of examples. It's sources 3 and 4. Source 3 is a technical rule about a certain category that happens when a girl turns 3. And what would happen if the girl turns 3, and then the rabbis add an extra month of the year. So technically they thought, let's say her birthday was, on the 3rd day of Adar, and on the 4th day of Adar, the rabbis added an extra month. So technically she's not 3 anymore. So the best example of that is in source number 4, and it's something that can happen this year, that you have 2 Adars, right? In a Jewish leap year, you have 2 Adars. So the situation is as follows. In a year that is a Jewish leap year, boy number 1 is born on 27 Adar 1. Boy number 2 is born on 3 Adar 2. Which boy is older, boy number 1 or boy number 2? It's not a trick question. Exactly, boy number 1 is older. Boy number 1 is born on 27 Adar 1. Boy number 2, 3 Adar 2. The year of their bar mitzvah, there's only 1 Adar. If that's the case, boy number 2's going to be bar mitzvah on 3 Adar. Boy number 1 is going to be bar mitzvah on 27 Adar. Boy number 1 is older. Boy number 2 becomes bar mitzvah first and becomes older that year. A little bit mind-blowing, right? The younger becomes the older, because there is no 2 Adar. So even though chronologically speaking, boy number 2 is younger, the year of the bar mitzvah, boy number 2 becomes a man 3 weeks before boy number 1. That's another expression of the idea that time is not meant to only be chronological. Time is meant to be religious. Time is meant to be a sacred commodity. Any questions or comments or anything?
Rabbi, just going back to Hillel for a second, it's Howard. When he made this permanent calendar, were there any objections or fights against it, that people didn't want to do that and just leave it the other way?
So I would say that you have to remember, the history is written by the victors. So we don't have a record of that. But we do, the fact that it has been accepted without any dispute or without any opposing view, tells us that he was likely onto something. Right? We don't, other than that one, famous example, we don't encounter large disputes among the Jewish calendar. When you think about it, it's kind of amazing. Now we take for granted how, I could tell you what time candlelighting is anywhere. They even have the ability now. People sometimes trying to figure out, if you're flying on a fast day, and you want to know exactly when the fast ends, right? So when it gets dark outside, you'll know when the fast ends. But if you're flying, for example, if you're flying west, which elongates your fast, you really want to know when it gets night outside. They have ways of calculating that these days. right? So very little is unknown to us. But once upon a, to say that we've had this method of a calendar system in place for the last 1700 years or so without there being a major breakdown, it's pretty impressive. We know, for example, with regards to the secular, the solar calendar, it hasn't been the case, right? They used to have the Julian calendar, and then they added the Gregorian calendar. People familiar with that shift, right? It was basically on the fact that the Julian calendar assumed that the year was 365 days. It didn't take into account the quarter day. So whatever year it was,
they had to lose. They lost 16 days or so.
The day after October, April 4 was April 15. They just literally skipped 11 days to have things balance out. And that's actually how we have the change in liturgy on December 4th is actually connected to that. That's the only ritual that's connected regularly to the solar calendar. Usually it's seasonal, that we have holidays seasonally on the solar calendar, but it's the only time that a date on the secular calendar is important. It has to do with when we start saying "B'tein taldu mata livracha," the request for rain. But it highlights it's complicated. That calendar needed tinkering, right? The Muslim calendar is completely lunar exclusive, and therefore Ramadan changes every year. So we have the Jewish calendar, which has been able to be in place and essentially accurate and essentially universally held among the Jewish community since inception. So it's it's a pretty solid innovation. So any other questions? Yes.
I put in the chat when you have a yahrzeit sometime in Adar. I forgot when you have to say it twice. I don't remember, but it's
right. So, the same issue with bar mitzvah can happen with yahrzeit. If someone passes away in a year where there's only one Adar, what happens for the yahrzeit when there are two? So there is no uniform view. Sephardim generally observe the yahrzeit on the second Adar because they'll say the real Adar is when you celebrate Purim, right? That's the real Adar. So if you celebrate Purim in the second Adar, that's when you would certainly commemorate the yahrzeit. The Ashkenazic view either says, look, first Adar is 12 months since the last yahrzeit. That makes more sense. Or both. And I think actually the stronger view is for Ashkenazim is to commemorate the yahrzeit on both days. But that is sometimes difficult for people. So if you have to choose one, Ashkenazim generally would choose the first and not the second.
My first husband died in Adar 1, and I only observe, one yahrzeit. I base it on my father-in-law, who unfortunately had to bury a son who was quite, observant. I base it on his ruling.
Right. So some of the things have a certain, can be based on custom, but Purim, no one disagrees, is in the second Adar.
Do we know who celebrated in the Torah the first Shabbat type of Shabbat situation, lighting a candle? Do we know who?
So lighting a candle is a rabbinic way of fulfilling the biblical commandment to celebrate Shabbat. The first Shabbat of observance from the Jews is after they left Egypt, when they were commanded to collect man on every day except Shabbat. And there you have that first element of Shabbat being observed. And then, of course, 10 Commandments is when things become more official and more expanded upon. But an interesting idea, this idea of there being a week, right? This idea of time being determined, like the history of time is a fascinating subject. Like when did they start having weeks, and when did they start having months, and this breakdown. Look, the idea of a Sabbath of a week every seventh day. The Jews had Saturday, so then the Christians took Sunday, and the Muslims took Friday. One of the things that they keep toying with these days, one of these days, one of the things you can talk about today, they're considering, you have this work week. is the work week, is Sunday to Friday. That's the way it is in Israel. The way it used to be in America, it was Monday through Saturday. Sunday's the day of rest. They talking about 5-day work weeks. And, one of the things they've been studying in some countries is a 4-day work week. So this whole idea of dividing up time is a fascinating subject. For Jews, it's more than just the markers along the progression of time that have sacred opportunities like the weekly Shabbat, but the idea of giving Jews the commandment, the responsibility of taking control of time, both means that there's going to be some slippage because we're humans, so we're going to have to create mechanisms to prevent that slippage, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. Some of you may be thinking that this commandment of the Jewish calendar comes from HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. It's for you. Now, this pasuk in the Torah, which gives us the commandment of Jewish time, of the Jewish calendar, there's a very famous Rashi at the beginning of the Torah. When the Torah starts, Breshis bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. So there's a very famous question that is posed by Rabbi Yitzchak. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, why does the Torah begin with Bereshit, with creation, with the beginning? Right, the Torah is a religious guide for Jews. Why doesn't it begin with the first mitzvah? And the first mitzvah is the Jewish calendar. That's Rabbi Yitzchak's question. And the way it's usually understood is Rabbi Yitzchak is unhappy with it starting with creation. He wants it to start with mitzvahs. And that's how it's usually explained. And there's different answers. God's in charge of the world. It has to do with Israel. Our focus, though, now is when you think about it, it's a little bit of a silly question. Right? If you want to start with mitzvahs, so you're going to start with the calendar. Is that really the best mitzvah to start with? You're going to start with mitzvahs. Start with, I am the Lord your God. Or, sanctify, be holy. Like this idea, why does Rabbi Yitzchak feel you got to start with the calendar? And
maybe it has to do with the fact that the Jews just left slavery, and a slave is not in charge of his own time.
Right. Great.
He has no agency.
I think
and so God says, now the Pharaoh controlled you. He controlled your time. He controlled your life. Now you're going to define your time on your terms, and it will be, instead of your work to the Pharaoh, it'll be how you're going to perceive God. And that's why the first mitzvah is related to God and man, and the intersection of physical time and spiritual time.
So I think that's a terrific explanation. And I think that's why, I think that answers better why this is the first mitzvah to the Jews. Right? The Jews needed this mitzvah before they had Passover sacrifice, and before they had matzah, and before they had anything else. They needed a mitzvah which essentially frees them and empowers them to take responsibility for time. At the same time, I don't know if it warrants starting the Torah with this mitzvah. If I'm looking to start the Torah with something other than Genesis, maybe I would, I need this mitzvah within the context of the Exodus story. And Rabbi Yitzchak isn't saying start the Torah with the Exodus story. Rabbi Yitzchak is saying start with this mitzvah. And I think that your explanation can help us explain that, because really the Torah is meant to be an empowering document for the Jewish people to appreciate that we are creators. The mitzvah of sanctifying time is essentially the mitzvah to create. The reason why Rabbi Yitzchak thinks it should go first is Rabbi Yitzchak thinks have a Jewish calendar is basically the same as being told, be like God. Just like God creates, by having control over time, you become a creator. And I think that's critical. I think it very much fits in with the importance of this being the first mitzvah that Brian was discussing. And I would go one step further and say the question is even more powerful, that if we would want to start the Torah with this command, and we would think to start the Torah with the commandment of have a calendar, because the commandment to have a calendar is the same thing as saying create. And so it goes even deeper than the way Brian was explaining it, that yes, the first mitzvah needs to free the Jews. But this first mitzvah is actually is the same as saying in the beginning, God created. God created, man created. Why don't we start with man creating and start with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, have a Jewish calendar. And it's a very empowering concept, that not only should it be the first mitzvah, But some people, like Rabbi Yitzchak, would think that this is the exact same thing as saying in the beginning, create. In the beginning, God created should be replaced with human beings control time. It highlights a kind of awesome responsibility that we have to take control of ordinary and imbue it with tremendous sanctity. And so Rabbi Chaim Friedlander, that's source number 5, the idea of why it is so empowering to have that ability to sanctify. Even, for example, Shabbat, which happens automatically, we can start Shabbat by saying it's now Shabbos, right? This whole idea is Shabbos automatically starts at sunset on Friday, but anytime in the last hour and a half or so of the day, I can declare something to be Shabbos. If I say it's Shabbos, it's Shabbos. So much so that, many of us, we come to shul on a Friday before Mincha. It's not even Shabbos yet. How do we greet each other?
Good Shabbos.
Shabbos. Some would even say that by that declaration, you've made it Shabbos and you can't daven Mincha anymore. Because Mincha is a Friday prayer. And once you said Good Shabbos, it's no longer Friday, it's Shabbos. So even though we don't control when Shabbos is, we do have the ability to add on to Shabbos, to make Friday into Shabbos. And that all comes from this empowerment of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, have a Jewish calendar. Yes, Howard.
I'm reminded of something that always stumped me, is that the calendar that's accepted by the world starts on a Sunday and ends on a Saturday, which ties in more with the Jewish day of rest than the non-Jewish day of rest, which is the majority in the world. How did the calendar that we all use go from Sunday to Saturday? You ever think about that?
I never thought about that. It's a great question. Who had that first grid that went from Sunday to Saturday?
Because they could argue it should be Monday to Sunday for the majority.
Right.
Okay.
It's a good question. Something worth researching. If anyone finds answers, please share.
You said you can declare Shabbos, but how come in the summer you can't declare it until a certain time? You can't make it too early.
There are certain limitations. Remember, we don't control the parameters. Like we said, Shabbos begins when Friday's over. The parameters of when Friday's over were given to us by God, in the evening, and then it was morning. So when is the earliest that evening might be determined is about an hour and a half before sunset, which is 2.5 hours before nightfall. So there's certain parameters. So in the summer, 6:30, it's close enough, right? You can't do it at 4 o'clock. Interesting. In the winter, you could start Shabbos as early as 3 o'clock. I don't think anybody wants to. I never knew anyone wants to start Shabbos early in the winter time. And so therefore, here is, mitzvah number 4, the mitzvah of a calendar, which has within it, a springboard to conversation about the role time plays in Jewish ritual, and does create an element of Jewish time, the way we implement it, as well as really the power, the spiritual power we have in sanctifying time that comes from this commandment in the first place, which highlights the importance of all those expressions of using our time wisely really do apply when time is a holy commodity at our disposal to inspire us to make the most of our religious experiences. So much so, as we see here in this last source, that the way we control time is really the equivalent of creation of heaven and earth. So I think now it's time to stop. And if there are any other questions or comments, happy to take them. And as always, a pleasure studying at the Mitzvah Shir and L'chaim.
Chaim.